Welcome to today's deep dive. Today we're going to be tackling Herman Melville's Moby-Dick. I know it can seem a little daunting,
Yeah.
but I think you're going to find that there's a reason this book has captivated readers for centuries.
I think so too.
So hopefully today we can kind of chart a course through the major themes and characters.
Yeah, that's
so you can get those core insights without
getting lost.
getting too lost at sea. Yeah.
It's a big one.
Yeah, it is a big one.
It's a hefty read.
Yeah.
But it's packed with just incredible reflections on human nature and our place in this vast world, you know?
Yeah, and I think, one of the first places we have to start is Captain Ahab.
Sure.
I mean, this guy is like a man on a mission.
Yeah.
To put it mildly, his quest for revenge against the white whale, Moby-Dick, is legendary.
Yeah.
I mean, have you ever felt so driven by something that it just, consumed you?
It's wild, isn't it?
I can't imagine letting a grudge turn into, an epic sea voyage.
Yeah, his obsession is one of the things that makes this story so timeless, right?
Yeah.
Because, on the one hand, it's a cautionary tale.
Yeah.
About, be careful what you set your mind to because it might just take over your life.
Right.
But it also taps into this very human desire for control, for revenge.
Yeah.
That I think resonates with people even today.
Totally. So, Melville really walks this line.
He does.
Between passion and just straight up destructive obsession.
Yeah.
It really makes you wonder what could push someone that far.
Right. And, Melville gives us these glimpses into Ahab's psyche.
Yeah.
Through his language, right?
Right.
There's this one part, I think it's chapter 36, where Ahab describes Moby-Dick as, quote, all evil to crazy Ahab were visibly personified and made practically assailable in Moby-Dick.
Wow.
So, he's literally projecting all of his inner demons onto this whale.
Right, so it becomes more than just a way at that point.
Exactly.
There's this whole other layer of symbolism going on, especially with that, very striking white color. It's almost like it represents both purity and this immense unsettling power.
Totally. It's a symbol of the unknowable, that vastness and mystery of the ocean of nature itself.
Yeah.
Which we try to understand and control, but can never fully grasp.
Totally. And then we have Ishmael, our narrator.
Right.
Who's along for this wild ride.
Yeah.
I mean, he's kind of like the everyman seeking adventure and maybe a little bit of meaning on the open sea.
Total.
It's interesting how his perspective really shapes our understanding of this, larger-than-life whale.
His voice is key, right? Because he provides this really important counterpoint to Ahab's single-mindedness.
Right.
He observes, he reflects, and he's trying to make sense of this chaos and obsession that's all around him.
Yeah.
He's the one that helps us navigate the philosophical depths of the story.
What struck you most about Ishmael's character?
I think there's something universally relatable about his desire for adventure and self-discovery. He's thrown into this extraordinary situation.
Right.
But he never loses sight of his humanity.
Totally. And of course, he's not alone on this journey.
Of course not.
I mean, the crew of the Pequod is kind of like a microcosm of society itself. It's so diverse.
Yeah.
Each of them with their own worldview and their own motivations.
Exactly.
You've got Queequeg the harpooner, who forms this incredibly deep bond with Ishmael.
Yeah.
And then there's Starbuck, the first mate.
Right.
Who's constantly trying to reason with Ahab to bring him back from the brink of madness.
Right. Their relationship is really fascinating, this clash between loyalty and duty.
Right.
And the dangers of blind faith.
Totally. It makes you think about all the different ways people cope with being isolated.
Yeah.
Stuck on a whaling ship in the middle of a vast ocean.
Absolutely.
I mean, they're thrown together from all walks of life.
Yeah.
Forced to confront not only the external dangers,
right,
but also their own internal struggles.
Exactly. And it raises questions about leadership.
Yeah.
About that fine line between authority and tyranny.
Right.
And about the bonds that can form even in the harshest environments.
Speaking of challenges, I have to admit, Melville's writing style took some getting used to.
Yeah.
It's not your typical adventure story, you know? He throws in these philosophical digressions, these poetic reflections that can be a bit dense at times.
Yeah.
Did you find those challenging or rewarding?
Well, it's a unique style for sure.
Yeah.
I think he was a master of weaving in these philosophical layers without sacrificing the momentum of the story.
Right.
There's one part, I think it's chapter 94.
Okay.
He goes in this whole tangent about the whiteness of the whale.
Okay.
And how it represents, quote, the heartless voids and immensities of the universe.
Wow.
It's like he's challenging us to think about the bigger picture,
Yeah.
to go beyond the surface level of the narrative.
And that's where the real depth of the book lies, right?
Absolutely.
It's not just an adventure story. It's a deep dive into the human psyche, into our relationship with the natural world.
Again, it's a book that makes you think,
Yeah.
that stays with you long after you finish reading it.
Absolutely. I agree. There's so much more to unpack here, but I think we've laid a pretty solid foundation for understanding the core themes and characters.
Yeah, that's so.
Now, before we move on, I want to ask you,
Sure.
what stood out to you the most from this kind of first exploration of Moby-Dick?
Oh, that's a good question.
Was there a particular passage or a character that resonated with you?
Let me think about that for a second.
Yeah.
There were so many fascinating layers to uncover, but honestly, one passage that really stayed with me was Ahab's speech to the blacksmith, chapter 113.
Oh, okay.
He says, quote, "I'd strike the sun if it insulted me."
Wow.
And that line just encapsulates his defiance,
Yeah.
his almost godlike ambition to challenge even the forces of nature.
Right. It really speaks to that idea of man versus nature that seems to run throughout the whole book.
Absolutely. And, to really grasp the depths of that theme, I think it's crucial to understand a bit about the man behind the masterpiece, Herman Melville himself. His own experiences are woven into the fabric of the story.
That's a great point. Sometimes knowing the author's background can really illuminate a work of literature. So paint a picture for us. Who was Herman Melville and what kind of world did he live in?
Okay, so imagine 1819 New York City.
Okay.
A young Melville is born into this era of immense change and expansion in America. The whaling industry is booming. Stories of daring sea voyages are captivating the public imagination.
Right.
And Melville, he doesn't just read about these adventures, he lives them.
Wow.
As a young man, he sets sail on whaling ships, travels to exotic ports, even lives among the typists in the South Pacific.
Wow. Living among the typists, that's quite a departure from life in New York City. I can see how those firsthand experiences would really fuel his writing, especially in a book like Moby-Dick.
You hit the nail on the head. The novel's vivid descriptions of life aboard a whaling ship, the camaraderie, the dangers, the sheer brutality of the hunt, it all comes from a place of deep personal understanding. He wasn't just imagining it, he had lived it.
Right. It makes you realize that Moby-Dick isn't just this thrilling adventure story. It's also a product of its time, reflecting the social and intellectual currents of 19th century America.
Precisely. The 19th century was this time of intense philosophical and scientific exploration.
Right.
People were grappling with questions of faith, destiny, and humanity's place in the natural order. Think about Darwin's theory of evolution, which was published just a few years before Moby-Dick.
Right.
These ideas were shaking the foundations of society, and you see those anxieties reflected in Melville's work.
That's fascinating. So in a way, Melville was grappling with some of the same existential questions that we're still wrestling with today.
Absolutely.
But it's interesting that he wasn't exactly a literary superstar during his lifetime. In fact, I heard that Moby-Dick wasn't exactly a bestseller when it was first published.
It's true. It was a commercial failure, initially. Critics found it too dark, too complex, too different from the popular adventure tales of the time.
Wow, a masterpiece being overlooked in its own era.
Makes you wonder, are there books being published today that might become classics in the future books we're overlooking right now?
It's a thought-provoking question. But back to Moby-Dick, what do you think changed? Why is it considered a classic now?
It's like the world had to catch up to Melville's vision.
Right.
I think over time, as readers became more comfortable with exploring darker themes and more experimental writing styles, they started to recognize the brilliance of Moby-Dick.
Yeah, the psychological complexity, the philosophical depth, those timeless themes that really speak across generations. It's like the book was ahead of its time.
And perhaps that's why it continues to resonate with readers today.
Yeah.
It's a book that speaks to the enduring human struggle with ambition, obsession, and the desire to make sense of a world that can often feel chaotic and unpredictable.
It's like we're still trying to answer the same questions that Melville was wrestling with back in the 19th century. It's amazing how a book can transcend time and place like that.
You're right. It's
Yeah.
remarkable. And, speaking of things that transcend their literal meaning,
Yeah.
we touched on the symbolism of the whale earlier.
All right.
But Moby-Dick is overflowing with symbols.
It is.
What are some of the others that stand out to you?
Well, you can't talk about Moby-Dick without mentioning the Pequod itself.
Of course.
I mean, it's more than just a ship. It becomes this floating microcosm of the world,
Right.
a stage where all these diverse characters are thrown together and forced to confront their own beliefs and limitations.
It's like a pressure cooker of human interaction, isn't it?
Yeah!
With Ahab at the
Yeah.
helm, steering them all towards this inevitable collision with fate.
Yeah.
And it's within that confined space that the real drama unfolds.
Right.
You have Ahab driven by this monomaniacal obsession and Starbuck desperately trying to appeal to reason to steer them away from disaster.
And then you have Ishmael caught in the middle trying to make sense of it all.
Right. He's like the reader,
Yeah.
grappling with the complexities of the story and the larger questions it raises about the human condition.
That's such a perceptive point. Ishmael's journey becomes our journey as readers.
It does.
We're right there with him, trying to navigate the moral ambiguities, the philosophical depths, the sheer force of Melville's prose.
I love that you mentioned the prose.
Yeah.
It's not always easy to read,
Right.
but there are these moments of sheer lyrical beauty, especially in his descriptions of the sea.
Yeah.
He captures the power and majesty of nature with such vivid imagery. It's almost like you can feel the salt spray on your face, smell the briny air.
Oh, absolutely. One passage that always gives me chills is from chapter 58, where Melville describes the sea as, quote, one vast, undulating, all-embracing tomb.
Wow.
That sense of awe and terror, the beauty and the danger, it's all captured in those words.
And that brings us back to the central question. Is Moby-Dick truly a force of evil, a symbol of nature's indifference, or something else entirely?
Right. I think that's one of the brilliant things about Moby-Dick. It doesn't offer easy answers.
It doesn't.
It leaves us grappling with the ambiguity, the complexities of good and evil fate and free will. It's not a simple battle between man and nature. It's something much deeper and more profound.
It's like Melville is suggesting that perhaps the real monster is not the whale, but the darkness that resides within the human heart.
Right.
The capacity for obsession and self-destruction that drives Ahab to his doom.
It's like the whale is a mirror,
Yeah.
reflecting back the darkest parts of ourselves.
Exactly.
And that's a terrifying thought, but also incredibly thought-provoking. I think that's why Moby-Dick continues to fascinate us, to haunt us.
Yeah,
It forces us to confront those uncomfortable truths about our own nature.
I completely agree. It's a book that lingers in your mind long after you've finished reading it, prompting you to ask those big questions about the meaning of life, the limits of human ambition, and the power of nature to both inspire and terrify us.
And speaking of being terrified, there are some pretty gruesome scenes in the book.
There are.
Melville doesn't shy away from depicting the brutality of whaling. I mean, the scene where they're carving up the whale, it's pretty intense.
It's definitely not for the faint of heart. But those graphic descriptions serve a purpose.
Right.
They force us to confront the reality of the whaling industry, the violence and exploitation that was inherent in that pursuit.
Right.
It's easy to romanticize the idea of whaling, but Melville pulls back the curtain and shows us the bloody, messy reality.
It's a stark reminder that our relationship with nature isn't always harmonious. Sometimes it's a struggle for dominance, a battle for survival. And that brings us back to Ahab. Is his obsession with Moby-Dick just about revenge, or is there something deeper at play?
I think it's about control.
Okay.
He's trying to impose his will on nature, on a force that is ultimately beyond his grasp.
Right.
It's a futile quest, but it speaks to this very human desire to conquer the unknown, to tame the wild. And in doing so, Ahab ultimately destroys himself and those around him.
It's a powerful message about the dangers of unchecked ambition and the need for humility in the face of forces greater than ourselves. But I'm curious, do you think there's any redemption for Ahab in the end?
That's a tough one. I think Melville leaves it open to interpretation. Some might see Ahab's final moments as a kind of tragic heroism,
Right.
a defiant stand against the indifference of the universe.
Oh.
Others might see it as the ultimate act of self-destruction, a cautionary tale about the pitfalls of pride and obsession.
It's almost like Melville is saying, here's the story, now you decide what it means. He doesn't offer easy answers, but he gives us plenty to think about.
Exactly. And that's the beauty of Moby-Dick. It's a book that continues to challenge us, to provoke us, to make us question our assumptions about the world and our place in it.
Speaking of challenging assumptions, one of the things that struck me about Moby-Dick is the way Melville portrays the relationship between Ishmael and Queequeg.
Oh, yeah.
It's this incredibly tender and complex bond that transcends race and culture.
You're right. Their friendship is a powerful counterpoint to the prevailing prejudices of the time.
Yeah.
Melville seems to be suggesting that true connection, true brotherhood is possible even between people from vastly different backgrounds.
It's a radical idea for the 19th century, and sadly, it's still relevant today. In a world that's often divided by fear and intolerance, Ishmael and Queequeg's friendship offers a glimpse of hope, a reminder that human connection is possible across all boundaries.
Absolutely. It's a testament to Melville's vision and his ability to create characters that resonate with readers across generations.
Now, before we wrap up this part of our deep dive, I want to ask you a question that's been on my mind.
Okay.
We've talked a lot about the deeper meaning of Moby-Dick, the symbolism, the philosophical themes.
All right.
But what about the sheer joy of the story? Did you find yourself getting swept up in the adventure, the excitement of the chase?
You know, it's interesting. I think that's one of the things that makes Moby-Dick such a masterful work of literature. It operates on so many levels. It's a thrilling adventure story, a philosophical treatise, a psychological drama, all wrapped up in this epic tale of man versus nature. And yes, there are definitely moments where you get caught up in the suspense, the sheer audacity of Ahab's quest. Melville's prose has this way of pulling you into the world of the story, making you feel the wind in your hair, the spray of the sea on your face.
It's like you're right there on the Pequod with them bracing yourself against the storm, feeling the thrill of the hunt. And I think that's what ultimately makes Moby-Dick such an enduring classic. It's a book that speaks to the head and the heart, a story that challenges us, entertains us, and leaves us with a profound sense of wonder.
You couldn't have said it better myself. Moby-Dick is a true testament to the power of storytelling, a reminder that even the most complex and challenging ideas can be conveyed through a compelling narrative.
And on that note, I think we've covered a lot of ground today. We've explored the symbolism, the historical context, the philosophical depths of Moby-Dick. But there's still one aspect we haven't touched on yet.
Oh, and what's that?
The ending. We've talked about the journey, but we haven't yet discussed the destination. And I think the ending of Moby-Dick is just as powerful, just as thought-provoking as the rest of the book.
You're absolutely right. And I think it's the perfect place to pick up in our next segment. We'll delve into the final confrontation between Ahab and Moby-Dick, explore the symbolism of the vortex, and discuss what, if any, meaning can be found in the aftermath of such a catastrophic event.
I can't wait. So to our listeners, stay tuned as we conclude our deep dive into the world of Moby-Dick. Welcome back to our deep dive into Moby-Dick. You know, we've explored the symbolism, the characters, the historical context, but now we're approaching the climax of the book, that final confrontation between Ahab and the white whale.
Right.
It's almost like we've been on this journey alongside the Pequod, just bracing ourselves for the inevitable.
There is this sense of impending doom
Yeah.
that's been building throughout the entire book.
Totally.
And when it finally arrives, it's both breathtaking and terrifying.
I was completely on edge reading those final chapters. Can you set the scene for us? What's the atmosphere like as Ahab finally faces Moby-Dick?
Okay, so imagine this. The sea is calm, almost eerily so.
Okay.
The Pequod, once so proud, is now battered and weary from the chase.
Right.
And Ahab, consumed by his obsession, is like a man possessed.
Yeah.
He stands on deck, harpoon in hand, his one good leg strapped to the mast, defying both man and nature.
It's almost Shakespearean.
It is.
This image of Ahab standing against the elements, challenging fate itself.
Exactly. And then there's Moby-Dick bursting forth from the depths, this embodiment of power and fury.
Right.
Melville describes him as a snow hill in the air,
Yeah.
this colossal creature that dwarfs even the mighty Pequod. The air crackles with tension, and you can almost hear the whales spout like a primal roar echoing across the waves.
So at this point, it's no longer just about hunting a whale.
No.
It's become this epic battle of wills, a clash between human ambition and the untamed forces of nature.
Precisely. And as the Pequod is drawn into the vortex created by the sinking whale, it's like the very fabric of reality is being torn apart.
Yeah.
What did you make of that symbolism, the vortex?
I found it incredibly powerful. It's almost like a visual representation of Ahab's obsession, this swirling force that consumes everything in its path.
Yeah.
And it's not just Ahab who's destroyed, it's the entire crew, the ship, everything except for Ishmael, who manages to cling to a coffin and survive.
Right. And Ishmael's survival is significant.
Yeah, why is that?
Well, because it suggests that there's hope even in the face of such overwhelming tragedy.
Okay.
He represents the possibility of rebirth, of finding meaning, even in the midst of chaos and loss.
I also found it interesting that he survives by clinging to a coffin of all things.
Yeah.
What do you make of that?
It's brilliant. It's full of layers of meaning. I mean, the coffin could symbolize death, of course, but it also represents rebirth.
Right.
A kind of womb from which Ishmael emerges into a new life. It's like Melville is suggesting that sometimes we have to confront our own mortality in order to truly appreciate the preciousness of life.
And in a way, his survival allows the story to be told.
Right.
He becomes the witness, the one who carries the burden of memory and the responsibility of sharing what he's learned.
You're absolutely right.
Yeah.
And that's what makes the ending of Moby-Dick so haunting, so unforgettable.
Yeah.
It leaves us with this profound sense of loss,
Right.
but also with a glimmer of hope, the possibility of redemption and renewal.
So we've reached the end of our deep dive into Moby-Dick. It's been quite a journey full of thrilling adventure, profound insights, and moments of sheer literary brilliance. But before we wrap up, I want to ask you one final question. What do you think is the legacy of Moby-Dick? Why does this book continue to resonate with readers centuries after it was written?
I think it's because Moby-Dick taps into these universal themes that transcend time and place. It's about the human struggle with obsession, the desire for revenge, the search for meaning in a world that can often feel chaotic and unpredictable. But it's also about the beauty and power of nature, the resilience of the human spirit, and the possibility of finding hope even in the face of tragedy. Moby-Dick isn't just a story, it's a reflection of the human condition, a mirror that shows us both the darkness and the light within ourselves. And that's why I think it will continue to be read and discussed for generations to come.
Beautifully said. And to our listener, we hope this deep dive has given you a new appreciation for the depth and complexity of Moby-Dick. It's a book that demands to be reinterpreted and re-examined. So if you haven't already, we encourage you to embark on your own voyage into the world of Herman Melville's masterpiece. And until our next deep dive, keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep seeking out those stories that illuminate the depths of the human experience.